The theme of the retreat is a journey through mystical England or a pilgrimage through mystical England. And so the history, the spiritual history of England is filled with a number of amazing figures from ancient times, medieval times, really up into the present day. And it certainly has been very formational for my own spiritual life and my own ministry as a spiritual director to draw on the wisdom of figures like Evelyn Underhill or C.S. Lewis or Julian of Norwich, and to apply their wisdom to, again, to both my personal spiritual practice, but also the work that I have been blessed to do as a spiritual companion. Spiritual companionship was really very much a part of the tradition of the English mystics. We see Julian of Norwich, for example, was spiritual director to another medieval mystic named Marjorie Kempe. So we know about that. The Cloud of Unknowing, the author is anonymous. We don't know where he lived, but we do know he was a spiritual director, that his book is actually a book of guidance that he was offering to a young monk. So that theme shows up again and again. So I think anybody who is interested in the work of spiritual companionship, whether as a spiritual director, spiritual guide, or as somebody who receives that ministry from another, would find this experience really deeply spiritually nurturing. So it is, of course, it's England. We'll be going to London. We'll be going to Oxford. We'll be going to Norwich. We'll be going to a retreat center called Pleshy, which was associated with Evelyn Underhill, who's probably the most prominent 20th century English mystic. So we're going to be visiting some wonderful locations, obviously forming a small community as we go along, and really just enjoying the culture and the history and the natural beauty of England, but also taking a deep dive into the spiritual treasures there. Let's start with Julian of Norwich. Julian was a medieval woman who lived in the 14th century into the early 15th century. She lived at the time of the bubonic plague, the time of the Hundred Years' War, the peasant uprisings. It was a very turbulent period in English history and in medieval history. It was, she died probably right about 100 years before the Protestant Reformation. So it was a time of kind of spiritual ferment in England and in Europe at large. And so Julian comes along, and when she's 30 years old, she has a series of mystical visions. And following those series of mystical visions, she devotes herself to a life of prayer and solitude. But she wasn't exactly a hermit in that she lived her solitary life actually in a cell attached to a church right there in the middle of town. Norwich in the Middle Ages was actually one of the larger towns in England. It was a trading center. And so it was a bustling space where she kind of set up shop as this woman of deep prayer and contemplation and meditation. And we know from the kind of ministry that she had was that part of her work was providing guidance to people who had come to her, people with prayer requests, people with spiritual, questions or concerns of their own. And she would provide a listening ear and perhaps, some thoughts of her own. And she, in her own writing, she doesn't really talk about her ministry of spiritual guidance, but we know at least one of the people that she worked with did. And this is a woman named Marjorie Kempe, who is distinguished for having written the first autobiography by a woman in the English language. And Marjorie was herself a mystic and is regarded as a significant figure in the history of English spirituality. And in her book, it's her autobiography, she recounts going to Norwich, and because she lived about 20 miles away, and back then that would have been a significant journey. So going to Norwich and visiting with, she called her Julian the recluse of Norwich. We would say probably solitary, but and when she starts describing her experience with Julian, Julian's voice shines through. Marjorie's very faithful in her recounting of the conversations she had with Julian. And what you see is that Julian supported Marjorie in discernment. She encouraged Marjorie in her own spiritual practice, her own spiritual life. Of course, we're working within a Christian context here, but very much encouraging Marjorie in her devotion to God, her devotion to Christ. So it is really a wonderful kind of snapshot into the mystery of spiritual guidance, the ministry of spiritual guidance as it occurred 650 years ago. Closer to our day, we do have Evelyn Underhill, the woman who's really renowned as a scholar of mystical spirituality, and who wrote a number of books. Was considered, I think, one of the archbishops of Canterbury said she was the most important spiritual teacher in England in the period between the two world wars. Some pretty high praise from a pretty significant figure. And what we know from her is that we know she received spiritual guidance from her. We know of at least two or three of the people who served as her spiritual directors. But then we also know that she herself had a ministry of spiritual companionship and spiritual guidance, and that she did a lot of work with people through letters. And so her collected letters are an insight into her wisdom and her ability to support other people in their spiritual life. So, following in kind of the Christian contemplative, the broader Christian contemplative tradition. But Evelyn Underhill herself was somebody who was very much interested in interreligious dialogue, interfaith dialogue, ecumenical dialogue. She had interest in I guess what we would call magical or even occult spirituality, particularly when she was young. Uh, at a more mature chapter of her life, she was very much engaged in conversation with Eastern Orthodox Christians. So once again, she was rooted in a tradition, in her tradition, Anglican Christianity, but with that very broad, expansive embrace of all positive spiritual paths, which I know is very much part of the culture of SDI as well. So she, once again, we see in her letters this incredible affirmation, this willingness to meet people where they are, but always to encourage them to go deeper, to encourage them to really foreground their spiritual practice and their spiritual journey as a central part of their lives. We're also hoping to visit the Tate in London, where there is a splendid collection of art by William Blake. And while I'm not sure myself, I'm not a Blake scholar, so I'm not sure about how spiritual direction or spiritual guidance was part of his life, but he certainly was a significant mystical figure in the history of English spirituality. And what makes Blake so amazing is he was a world-class poet, but also a significant artist. So you can enter into his spirituality through his words, but also through his imagery. So it really will be a treat to go spend some time with the Blake collection there at the Tate. We're also looking at, and we're still working out the details here, but we're also looking at touring the Mithraeum, which is an ancient pre-Christian site from the era of Roman Britain. And anybody who may be familiar with Roman pagan spirituality, there was a cult, and not in the dirty word sense of the word, but just in an objective sense. There was a cult of Mithras. So Mithras was a pagan deity that people engaged in, and there was a temple to Mithras in London, and of course it's in ruins now, but you can still tour the ruins today. So I think that'll be a wonderful opportunity for us to England, of course, for almost 2,000 years now, has the dominant religion has been Christianity, and much of the tour will be looking at various Christian figures. But it will be fun to have at least a little bit of time where we can dig even, deeper than the Christian culture, and to look at the more earth-based or more indigenous kind of spiritualities that were part of that part of the world in ancient times. With our day in Oxford, we will be again taking a dive into the spiritual friendship between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Again, both amazing writers out of the Christian tradition, but also writers who drew very much heavily out of the mythological kind of literature from the Celtic and the Norse periods. So again, we'll be looking at Christianity, but Christianity in a very broad and inclusive way as part of this experience. So, speaking very personally, as somebody with my own practice as a spiritual companion or spiritual guide, my membership in SDI has been so helpful for me. I've learned a lot from SDI resources that I've participated in, classes that I've taken, and I'm just really excited to have the opportunity to be engaged with a community of people connected to SDI during this experience. And I know that Reverend Seifu, the executive director of SDI, has committed to being on this trip. I'm really excited that he's going to be there as well. And so I think that this is really going to be a wonderful opportunity for people with some similar, commitments to the care of the soul, the care of not only the souls of the people who come to us for guidance and companionship, but the care of our own souls. That this really, yes, this is a tour, but it's also a pilgrimage. And I hope it will even have a bit of the energy of a retreat while we're together during our time in England.